In this module, we will cover Chapter 25 and 26. Chapter 25 discusses the anatomy and physiology of the urinary system, and Chapter 26 discusses a little bit more of the physiology of electrolyte and acid-base balance. So let's begin by discussing the functions of the urinary system. So the urinary system is principally going to regulate both the composition of body water and the amount of electrolytes that's in our fluids and in our blood as well. It will also work to excrete metabolic waste. So these are nitrogen-containing wastes that are formed when things like proteins are broken down. And so it's going to add those to the fluid that will eventually become urine and will be secreted from our body or excreted from our body. During times of prolonged fasting, the kidneys will perform gluconeogenesis. So recall that the process of gluconeogenesis was the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like lipids and amino acids. And so during times of prolonged fasting, the kidneys will act in this capacity as well. In our previous discussion of nutrition and metabolism, we discussed gluconeogenesis in the liver, but that's not the only place that it's occurring. It's also occurring or can occur in the kidneys as well. The urinary system also regulates acid-base balance within the blood. That regulates essentially the pH of the blood. The kidneys in particular are producing a couple of hormones, these are two hormones we've discussed previously, but we'll review their functions here. Erythropoietin, recall, regulates the production of red blood cells by the red bone marrow. So the more erythropoietin that we have being released by the kidneys, the more red blood cells will be formed in that period of time. Renin was a hormone that's secreted by the kidneys and regulates blood pressure by acting through the renin-angiotensin and aldosterone mechanism that we saw in Chapter 19. So recall that low blood pressure will cause an increase in the release of renin. So low blood pressure means high renin being released from the kidney, and renin works through that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism to raise blood pressure. We also see the kidneys functioning in a capacity to convert vitamin D to its active form. So recall that the skin produces an inactive form of vitamin D, and the kidneys put essentially the finishing touches on finalizing that vitamin so that it is activated and ready to use by the body. So let's look at the urinary system structure. So we've really got this list of 4 structures here. We've got the paired kidneys and paired ureters here. So the kidneys are what are going to be our filtering mechanism for the blood. We'll see a large collection of blood vessels within the kidneys, and this is where the filtering and the processing of blood is occurring to form a solution called filtrate, and the filtrate will then leave the kidneys through the paired ureters. So the ureters, there is one that leaves each kidney. The ureters direct the flow of filtrate or urine down to the urinary bladder, where it is stored, and then finally the urinary bladder can be emptied or voided through the urethra. So just looking at these structures here, we have the 2 paired kidneys here, kind of a reddish-brown bean-shaped organ here. From the center of each kidney, there is a small slit-like structure in its center called the renal hilum. From the renal hilum, one of the structures that emerges from it is the ureter here. So the ureter is directing the flow of urine that's produced by the kidney down to the urinary bladder to be stored. The renal hilum also provides an entrance for the major renal blood vessels that are here, the renal artery, and which directs blood to the kidney, and the renal vein, which is returning blood back to the inferior vena cava here. We also see in this diagram at the At the base of it is the urethra, which allows the bladder to be emptied when it is approaching its state of being full. Talking about the kidney location and size, the kidneys inhabit or are found in a region of approximately 4 vertebrae here. They begin at the region of about the 12th thoracic vertebra, T12, and the kidneys span a space to about or are found occupying the space between thoracic vertebra number 12 all the way down to lumbar vertebra number 3, or L3 here. So they take up a space of approximately 4 vertebra at the kind of at the transition between the thoracic and lumbar vertebral column regions. The right kidney is a little bit lower than the left kidney anatomically, simply because of the position of the liver on the right side of the body. So a good bulk of the liver takes up the right side of the body here. And so that displaces the right kidney, or is kind of forced to make the position of the right kidney a little bit lower than the left kidney. You can see they're fairly well covered by the ribs, except for the very inferior part of the kidney is exposed at the base of the rib cage there. But for the most part, the kidneys are covered by the ribs. The kidneys are roughly 5 or so inches long and about 3 or so inches wide. If we look at the kind of looking towards the internal anatomy of the kidneys, we'll turn our attention briefly here to some supportive connective tissue layers that surround the kidney. So we see 3 layers of connective tissue that surround and support the kidney. The first layer that I'll draw your attention to is actually the deepest layer of these 3 layers here, and it rests right on the surface of the kidney. This is called the fibrous capsule, and its job is to protect the kidney from the spread of infection. So if nearby structures like digestive system structures are experiencing an infection, this capsule helps to kind of insulate the kidney from that from nearby infection. So it really helps to prevent the spread of infection from nearby structures. This yellowish layer here that's surrounding most of the kidney and the blood vessels, the renal artery and veins that enter and exit the kidneys respectively. This yellowish layer that we see here is called the perirenal fat capsule. It's a layer of adipose tissue that serves to cushion the kidney. And finally, we have another thin layer of connective tissue that wraps around the perirenal fat capsule and the kidney itself. This more superficial layer is called the renal fascia. And the renal fascia's job is to really kind of anchor the kidney and the perirenal fat capsule to nearby structures. So it keeps the kidney secure in its location at the base of the rib cage there. So because the kidney is not completely protected by the rib cage, we see that the inferior part of the kidney here is highly susceptible to trauma because it doesn't have a bony support and protection around it. The middle and superior aspects of the kidney are well protected by the rib cage, but the inferior part of it is not. And so that makes the inferior part of it highly susceptible to trauma. These injuries could include really traumatic injuries like falls, car crashes, contact sport injuries. So anything where there's a high amount of force or trauma to that part of the body could easily damage the kidney. The renal artery in particular, even with the perirenal fat capsule surrounding it, the renal artery is still very vulnerable to rapid decelerations, like what occur during car crashes or contact sports, and is also highly susceptible to blood clots because we do see a lot of blood flow within the kidney in order to, not surprisingly, in order to be able to perform its function of filtering the blood, the kidney needs to have a really good blood supply. And so for that reason, we see that the kidney, particularly the renal artery, is susceptible to blood clots. And blood clots could severely impair kidney function. Okay, so we discussed a little bit about what's around the kidney, what's nearby the kidney. Let's take a look now at the internal anatomy of the kidney. Now, if we were to coronally or frontally section a kidney and look at its interior, what we're going to see is we're going to see two layers or two distinct regions here. We're going to see a region called the renal cortex, which is the most superficial layer of the kidney. It's kind of lightly colored, and it has a sort of granular appearance to it. I'll skip ahead here to the next slide so you can see this superficial layer that is the renal cortex here. This on the left is a real kidney. This, of course, is a diagram over here, but you can clearly see the renal cortex in this diagram here. The inner part of the kidney, or the deepest parts of the kidney, are referred to as the renal medulla. And the renal medulla is segmented into these cone-shaped, very dark red structures called the renal pyramids. So looking ahead here, we can see that the middle of here is the renal medulla, and we can see that the renal medulla is segmented into these triangular shaped structures that we refer to as the renal pyramids. Looking again at the renal medulla, we see that the tip of the pyramids for the renal medulla faces internally or points internally, and we call those points or those tips of the pyramids the papilla, and those point internally towards essentially the drainage structures of the kidney. So we'll in a minute we'll discuss how filtrate is formed, blood filtrate is formed by the kidney, and then how that filtrate is directed out of the kidney through a series of tubes and channels. So the papilla of those pyramids point internally towards the deepest parts of the kidney. And we also see between the renal pyramids, we see these structures called renal columns that are essentially little divisions between the renal pyramids here. What these are, these renal columns, is that they are inward extensions of the renal cortex. So looking back, referring back to that diagram here, we'll point at the papilla here, so the tips of all of the renal pyramids here, that's the papilla pointing internally there. And we see the renal columns here as well, which are just kind of inward foldings or extensions of the renal cortex. Looking towards the drainage structures of the kidney, so filtrate that is formed by the pyramids is collected by a series of ducts. We'll look first at these structures called the minor calyces. Singular, we would just refer to one of these as a minor calyx. These are cup-shaped areas that surround the renal papilla. So when filtrate is coming out of the renal papilla, it is collected by, or it is directed towards the ureter first by this minor calyx here. So referring back to this here, we can see, if we look at the pyramid here, the papilla of the pyramid, we can see that immediately surrounding it is this little tunnel-shaped structure, and those little tunnel-shaped structures are the minor calyces, or because this one's only pointing at one, it says minor calyx here. The minor calyces, or minor calyces, a little bit as they kind of make their way internally into the kidney, merge together to form the structure called major calyces. And major calyces are found between two structures. They're found between the minor calyces and a large structure called the renal pelvis. So several of these minor calyces here converge or merge together to form a major calyx. And finally, the major calyces all come together to form a structure called the renal pelvis, which is a larger funnel-shaped region or tube that is continuous with the ureter here. So the renal pelvis would be about right here, which all of the filtrate coming out of this, out of these pyramids here, would be directed into the minor calyces, then into the major calyces. Major calyces would direct that filtrate towards the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then directs that filtrate to the ureter so it can go and be stored in the urinary bladder. So we saw the minor calyces, the major calyces, and the renal pelvis. So in summarizing urine flow here, or filtrate flow, when urine or filtrate is formed by the kidney, it emerges from the papilla of the renal pyramid, enters the minor calyx, Minor calyx then directs that urine into the major calyx. The major calyx then directs that into the renal pelvis, and then finally into the ureter there. And we saw that within that diagram there. So if you want to think of the kidney as a large collection of blood vessels, that would be a very accurate description of it, because the kidneys are very richly vascularized, have a very rich blood supply, because if they're going to do that job, that task of filtering and cleansing the blood, removing the waste products from it, then it makes sense that it's going to be really well vascularized. And you see this really fine network of blood vessels that's within the renal cortex here. So in this last little segment before we wrap up this little module here, we'll look at how the blood vessels fan out within the kidney to these different structures in order to perform that function of cleansing the blood. So if we look at a chart or diagram of the blood flow, so coming off of the aorta, among other things, we'll focus on the renal artery here. So the renal artery comes right off of the aorta here, enters the kidney, immediately branches into a smaller set of arteries called the segmental artery. So if we back up here and take a look at that, we can see the renal artery entering the kidney at the renal hilum here, which is the renal hilum is that little vertical slit in the kidney that allows entry of the blood vessels and exiting of the ureter here. Anyway, so the renal artery here enters the kidney, branches extensively into slightly smaller arteries here that are the segmental arteries. The segmental arteries then branch again and become even smaller arteries called the interlobar arteries, and those interlobar arteries are actually found kind of in the region of the renal columns here, so where those little extensions of the renal cortex sit between the renal pyramids. The interlobar arteries then branch again to become sort of arch-shaped arteries called the arcuate arteries. The arcuate arteries kind of sit at the top of the renal, or I guess I should say the base of the renal pyramids here. That is the opposite end of the renal pyramids from the renal papilla here. So the broad end of the renal pyramids here are where you will find the arcuate arteries. From there, they will fan out into very, very fine little arteries called the cortical radiate arteries, which occupy much of the renal cortex here. So if you want a really easy way to remember the branching of the arteries as they enter the kidney and fan out, is a really helpful saying that I learned that goes like this: aim right straight in a commode. And so those letters correspond to the first letter of each of the arteries here. And it also is in the same order of blood flow that we see within the kidney. In a little bit here, we'll take a look at a structure called the nephron, which is essentially a fine ball of capillaries that has a collecting duct associated with it. So for now, we'll go ahead and skip those, and we'll turn our attention to the major veins that are draining the kidney here. So approximately in the same place as the cortical radiate arteries is a vein that drains the cortex of the kidney called the cortical radiate vein. So backing up here, we can see that the cortical radiate vein is in approximately the same location as our cortical radiate arteries here, kind of at the broad part of those renal pyramids. From there, the veins merge into slightly larger veins called the arcuate veins. The arcuate veins here, again, kind of located also at the base of the renal pyramids here, form kind of an arch shape there over the base of those renal pyramids, and drain blood, or are receiving blood from those cortical radiate veins that occupy the renal cortex there. Arcuate veins then merge into slightly larger interlobar veins that are found. The interlobar veins are found between or within the renal columns there, between the renal pyramids. The interlobar veins then merge into a large renal vein, which exits the kidney and delivers blood to the inferior vena cava. So if you want a really easy way to remember the blood flow of the veins that are leaving the kidney, you can commit this saying to memory here. Carefully aim in restroom interiors. So notice that it is backwards from this chart here, but what it is doing, what this saying is doing, is it is giving you the names of the blood vessels in the direction of blood flow. So we start with the cortical radiate veins, which become the arcuate veins, which become the interlobar, which become the renal veins, finally draining into the inferior vena cava there.